The Halifax Explosion of 1917 was undoubtedly one of the 20th century's greatest man-made disasters. The scale of this blast was such that many historians rank the Halifax Explosion as the single biggest man-made explosion to have ever occurred prior to the detonation of the atomic bomb. And it all started with two ships having a relatively minor collision. First, some background. 1917, as the First World War raged in Europe, the Allied nations outside of Europe, especially the US and Canada, were forced into using sea convoys to deliver essential supplies. German U-boats were wreaking havoc on shipping in the North Atlantic, and the safest way for vessels to travel is by convoy. As a result, ports and anchorages along the North American eastern seaboard become strategic hubs, places where these convoys could be organised and wait in safety until departure, and none was more important than Halifax Harbour in Canada's Nova Scotia district. Halifax Harbour was important for two reasons. The first was Bedford Basin, a natural deep water anchorage big enough to accommodate the largest merchant vessels. Over 100 ships could be anchored there simultaneously, which made Bedford Basin into one of the busiest military anchorages in the world. Secondly, Halifax City was the eastern terminus of the Intercolonial Railway, which allowed freight from factories, mines and farms across Canada and the northeast US to reach the Atlantic quickly. Troop trains carrying thousands of soldiers arrived almost daily, along with rail cars loaded with shells, explosives, military equipment, all of which were transferred directly onto the waiting ships. The docks operated around the clock, and unsurprisingly the harbour was almost always crowded with all manner of merchant and military shipping. Now, Bedford Basin did not open directly to the Atlantic Ocean. It was sheltered and accessible only through a much narrower channel, the tightest point of which was actually called the Narrows. This is a very apt name considering that the channel here was only around a quarter of a mile across, and in 1917 it was packed with all manner of wharves, docks, cranes, piers, some of which jutted well out into the channel, which further reduced the navigable area. To be blunt, it was a choke point which had to accommodate some of the largest merchant vessels in existence, and some very dangerous cargo to boot. Thursday, December the 6th, 1917 was not a foggy, snowy or windy day. In fact, the day dawned clear, calm and unseasonably mild. Visibility was excellent across Halifax Harbour with only light winds. The Narrows was busy, but not unusually so. At around 8:35 in the morning, two ships moving in different directions were converging on the Narrows. Coming out of Bedford Basin, heading southeast, carrying no cargo and moving quickly, was the SS Emo, a 430-foot-long 5,000-ton Norwegian steamship which had been delayed in the basin for several days. Eyewitness accounts say she was riding high in the water and travelling at around 7 knots, somewhat faster than the 5-knot speed limit allowed for the Narrows. Coming the other way, heading northwest into Bedford Basin, was the SS Mont Blanc, a 320-foot-long French tramp steamer coming from New York City. Her intention was to get into Bedford Basin to join the next North Atlantic convoy. She was bound for Bordeaux, carrying military supplies. In this case, military supplies is a somewhat euphemistic parlance for explosives. The Mont Blanc was in fact carrying 2,366 tons of picric acid, 250 tons of TNT, 62 tons of gun cotton, and 246 tons of liquid benzol, which was stored in metal drums on the deck. Carrying munitions on board a ship during wartime is, of course, a regular occurrence, but this cargo was on a scale that was well outside of the norms. In fact, it's probably not an exaggeration to say that the Mont Blanc carried one of the largest and most dangerous explosive cargoes ever transported through a civilian harbour, and one of the most powerful explosive cargoes ever carried aboard a merchant ship. It was doubly dangerous as it also contained a ready source of ignition, the benzol, which was stored in the drums on the deck. Anyway, at this point in the story, disaster is by no means guaranteed. Ships like these would regularly pass each other in the Narrows without any problems. The northbound vessel would stick to the east Dartmouth side, and vice versa. Also, each vessel was being navigated by a licensed Halifax pilot who knew the waters well and was an expert at Narrows navigation. On board the Mont Blanc was pilot Francis Mackey, and on the Emo was pilot William Hayes. However, on this fateful morning, a routine passing was unfortunately not to be. As the ships approached each other, the Emo swung out eastwards to avoid the SS Clara, which was being towed up the west bank. Having manoeuvred out into the eastbound lane, into oncoming traffic as it were, you would have expected the Emo to get back in her own lane, especially considering that the Mont Blanc was now dead ahead and coming the other way. But that's not what happened. The Mont Blanc issued a single horn blast, effectively saying, "Let's get back in our own lanes and we'll pass normally, port to port." But the Emo replied with 2 blasts, basically saying, "No, I'm coming round your starboard side, let's pass starboard to starboard." Remember, the Emo was exceeding the narrow speed limit and riding high in the water with no cargo, and this made her a little bit more twitchy in her handling. What happened next seems to resemble nothing more than a slow-motion train wreck. Both vessels remained on course, the Mont Blanc tooting 1 blast and the Emo tooting 2 blasts. As the vessels became increasingly close, Mackey on the Mont Blanc slowed down and hugged the eastern shore as tight as possible. By now, Hayes on the Emo realises that there's no room left for him to squeeze through on the starboard side, and he orders full astern. As the propeller pulls the ship back, the bow, being light in the water and riding high, swings towards the Mont Blanc and makes contact. There's a sickening crunch as the bow hits the side of the Mont Blanc. Some drums of benzol are split open, and as the SS Emo reverses, metal grinds, sparks fly, and within seconds the deck of the Mont Blanc is fully ablaze. The crew of the Mont Blanc are the only ones who understand the immediate danger. Due to wartime security protocols, the ship is not flying any flags identifying an explosive cargo. Realising the situation is hopeless, they abandon ship, rowing the lifeboats frantically towards the eastern shore, shouting out in French that the ship is about to explode. Now, only a few people understand them, and even then most of these assume that it's just panicked shouting. Nobody watching understands the danger that they're now in. The blazing ship, now at the mercy of the current, begins to drift across the Narrows. Tragically, this sight brings people out to watch, and a crowd soon builds up on the Halifax shore. Dock workers, tradesmen, housewives, shopkeepers, school children. The whole town seemingly has stopped to watch the sight of the huge burning ship slowly drifting across the Narrows. For 20 minutes, the blazing vessel drifts before coming to rest alongside Pier 6, just a stone's throw from the warehouses and houses of the Richmond district. At 9:04 am, SS Mont Blanc detonated alongside Pier 6 in Halifax Harbour. The explosion released an energy equivalent to approximately 2.9 kilotons of TNT, making it the largest human-made explosion in history at the time. In less than a second, the ship, its cargo, and much of the surrounding waterfront basically ceased to exist. The detonation occurred so rapidly that it produced a supersonic shockwave that radiated outwards at incredible speed. This blast wave flattened buildings, uprooted trees, stripped the ground bare across much of Halifax's north end. Eyewitnesses described seeing a brilliant white flash followed by a towering mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke, dust and debris that climbed more than 11,500 feet into the sky. The blast was heard more than 125 miles away, and windows were shattered over 50 miles away. Pieces of the Mont Blanc were hurled across the city, 1.5-ton anchor shaft landing over 2.5 miles away. The explosion also displaced millions of tons of water, briefly exposing parts of the harbour floor and generating a tsunami estimated at between 50 to 60 feet in height. This wave swept over the wharves and inundated sections of both Halifax and Dartmouth. Several smaller ships were sunk and others were just thrown onto the waterfront. The devastated North End bore absolutely no resemblance to what had been there just seconds before. Railway tracks were bent into twisted ribbons, brick buildings had been reduced to piles of rubble, and the city's wooden houses had either completely collapsed or had just been shredded into flying splinters. 2,000 people had been killed and over 9,000 were injured, and a further 25,000 people immediately found themselves homeless, all before the first rescuers could even begin to comprehend the scale of what had just happened. The residents of Halifax and Dartmouth who had not been injured immediately set to work trying to dig out survivors, but it was an almost hopeless task. Hospitals were soon overwhelmed, and to make matters worse, a fierce blizzard blew in that night, temperatures plummeted, and the rescuers had to dig through snow as well as debris to reach those who were alive but trapped. It's almost impossible to try and make any sense of even how you'd begin to deal with the aftermath of something like this, but in true wartime spirit, people began to immediately rebuild. The strategic importance of the harbour had, of course, not been forgotten, and within days, shipping was once again entering and leaving the harbour. Similarly, crews worked around the clock to repair the railway lines into the city, allowing for the arrival of much-needed relief supplies, including one train from Boston which carried doctors, surgeons, nurses, engineers, and more than 100 tons of medical equipment and supplies. The scale of the disaster was such that it made the front pages across the US and Canada even during wartime. Local communities across North America organised collections of money, clothing, blankets, food, fuel, medical supplies. Railways gave priority to relief trains going to Halifax, and doctors and nurses volunteered from Montreal, Toronto, Quebec City, and dozens of other towns. Teams of engineers set to work clearing the roads to open up access to the destroyed section of the city, but this was an immense task. The demolition and clearing of the Richmond district took over a year to complete, such was the scale of the disaster, although most bodies had been recovered by the spring of 1918. The crew and pilot of the Mont Blanc survived. They were able to get far enough away, but the crew of the Emo were less fortunate. The Emo was still fairly close by when the Mont Blanc blew, and the blast devastated her superstructure and killed some of the crew, including pilot Hayes, the captain, and the bridge crew. The Canadian government convened a formal wreck commissioner's inquiry, and on the 4th of February 1918, Justice Arthur Drysdale delivered a somewhat controversial ruling. He concluded that the Mont Blanc had violated the rules of navigation and held her pilot, Francis Mackey, and the captain wholly responsible. Mackey was arrested and briefly jailed before being released. Meanwhile, the ship owners were suing each other for millions of dollars in damages. Justice Drysdale, that same judge who'd presided over the criminal case, also heard these cases. Unsurprisingly, he once again ruled that the Mont Blanc alone was responsible. Eventually, under appeal, this criminal case went to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, which was Canada's highest court of appeal. This court overturned Drysdale's rulings and apportioned blame between the two vessels. Pilot Mackey spent years trying to clear his name and eventually regained his pilot's licence, but not before 1922. The Emo was salvaged and refitted, and she spent time as a Norwegian whale oil tanker before being wrecked by a drunken helmsman running aground on a rocky reef in the Falkland Islands. Eventually, under the auspices of the Halifax Relief Commission, Richmond's streets and houses were rebuilt. Town planner Thomas Adams redesigned parts of the devastated district into what was termed the Hydrostone neighbourhood. This was characterised by modern, fire-resistant homes and a planned urban layout. But it was almost impossible to simply rebuild the tight-knit working-class community that had existed before the explosion. Whole families had been wiped out in the blast, and many former residents just never came back. Throughout the 1920s, Richmond remained underpopulated, and it took a long time for any sense of community to re-emerge. Today, the old Richmond district survives as part of Halifax's North End. The Hydrostone neighbourhood has evolved from a planned community for displaced residents into one of Halifax's most desirable residential areas, known for its historic homes, local shops and cafes. Strolling there today, one would never guess that just over 100 years ago, the place resembled nothing more than literally ground zero of one of the world's largest ever non-nuclear explosions.